Hey, it's Don, the Auction Professor here. I've got another BOLO for you here. It's something that I actually like. It's going to be talking just about pulp magazines. It has fanciful artwork on most covers. Some of these go into the thousands of dollars. We're going to jump over the screen and we're going to talk about those right now. So today it's pulp magazines. It's basically looks like a comic book from the cover, but it's just a large version of a paperback novel, basically. And usually it has multiple stories in there. Usually not a lot of art. Sometimes there's advertisements. For the most part, there's not much. There are some incidental pieces of artwork in there, but the cover is almost always the best part of it. Sci-fi. There's tons of characters as well. It started on pulp, went to radio, comic books, TV, and then movies. And we're going to show you some of those now, too. Black Mask is a specific one. It has the story of the Maltese Falcon. Now, some of these are popular and very expensive because they published like a first H.G. Wells or some very famous stories. Some are very popular and sell for $1,000 because of the artist who did them, like Brundage or something along that line, who actually did the comic book or the comic-styled covers to these. My favorite comic books from the 40s, 50s, and 60s always were the painted cover versions of the comic books. And I've always tried to emulate some of that style as well, too. It's always my favorite, anyway. This one sold for $2,500. This is Black Mask. Now, we're going to show you some, and I'll call out some things they've done with them in more modern times. These are usually from the 20s, 30s, and 40s for the most part. After a later time frame, pulps weren't as into it. Comic books took over, small paperbacks took over, and things along that line. Weird Tales. This one's popular because it has H.P. Lovecraft. It has an early story by him in it. And it went for $1,800 because of that painted cover, really fanciful artwork. That's what I personally like. Saucy Movie Tales. There's a lot of titles called saucy. Some of these are a little risque, so I had to be very careful on the ones I put up. They're all family safe, I should say, but somebody might have an issue with some of the more outlandish covers. So anyway, this is a good one here too. $1,950. Saucy Romantic Adventures, another one, $1,650. Again, they're all painted covers for the most part. Book of Terror. Horror stories always sell. Sci-fi stories are usually #1. And then like detective, superheroes, combat, romance, all of those still have good genre interest in pulp. Even Western. $14.90 on this one. Book of Terror. Another Weird Tales. Now, a lot of these are recreated the covers, and they've made modern-day posters of these that you can buy. And then EC Comics actually made some similar titles to these, Weird Adventures and things along that line too. So anyway, this one went for $699. Captain Satan. This is a well-known one. It's well collected. This is an excellent edition of it. It basically looks like a comic book in all honesty. Here's just the typical what you see on these. But it's not. There's not like comic panel story cartoons in any of these, basically. It's just the cover is basically the best part, in my personal opinion. And that's why I would only collect these for just the artwork itself. So anyway, $637. Another Captain Satan. They're all kinds of strange topics. He's a detective, which is just a strange, bizarre thing. You can see the shadow behind him. And the shadow is another one who was a pulp regular character. So another Black Mask. G-Men and gangsters and the mob were a big thing back then, so was racketeering. So this is another example of that. Detective stories always sold. Another Weird Tales. Again, these are known examples. There's trading cards of just covers of some of these that are 60, 90 card sets. That's how popular the artwork is on these. $499. And this one has Robert E. Howard, well-known sci-fi bizarrist writer. So Captain Hazard. Again, there's just tons of different topics here. Adventure, jungle fantasy, and things like that. These are all pre-code, so a lot of the covers you couldn't show on like comic books and things after a certain date, somewhere in the 50s. And like on comic books and things like this, you'll see pre-code where they put items like syringe needles and people getting shot that they stopped showing because it wasn't going to be marketed towards children anymore. Astounding Stories. I love the sci-fi ones here, the blob creature that gets out of there. It's just an interesting artwork. I mean, all around, all these topics interest me. I love the artwork. That's the most important part in my book. Here's another one, The Monster Murderers, The Secret Six. These are series. There's tons of these in some cases. In some cases, there was a new one almost every week issued. So some of these runs, there's hundreds of different issues from the magazines, too. Here's where I find sometimes there'll be actually bound editions. Usually it ruins part of the magazine when you take them out. The Shadow I always enjoyed. My favorite is Alec Baldwin playing the Shadow. It's a good movie. It's a comic book related kind of thing, but I thought it was good. It's one that they really need to remake, kind of like The Dark Knight. They could do a real good one on the Shadow in my book. These always sell. It's hard to get these apart. That's the only bad part. You just pretty much have to leave them together, because otherwise you'll ruin the cover of these. You'll always have a strip that's damaged on them. The spine will probably be destroyed when you go to take these apart. So they're pretty much locked in, but it's still a good purchase and good sell. Terror Tales. This is a known one too. These are pretty creepy, some of the covers on these too. 15-cent ones usually were a little thicker. I know comic books were 10 cents even later on, even up into the 50s, but the pulps sometimes are 15 cents. And there were honestly some comic books that cost 15 cents back then as well, too. Depends on the size and how many pages they had. 349. Let's move on to the next one here. The Scorpion. There's another title called The Spider, which I run into occasionally, too. Usually I get the lower end ones that are worth 50 to say 150 bucks on average on these type of magazines. Not necessarily this title, but there's so many ones out there. Amazing Stories. Now this one, Steven Spielberg actually made a series, and if I'm not mistaken, a movie out of this line. And it had stories from H.G. Wells in this specific issue. So, but that's why a lot of these sell, because of the stories that are actually in the magazines. Astounding Stories. Again, these are all early 30s. This is issue number 3. This one's 20 cents. Just depends on the size and the manufacturer of them, but I don't think there's many over 20 cents. There may be one super thick one that's worth or sells for 25 at one point. You can see the thickness of the cover too. That just shows you how thick this issue is. So that's why it costs more than the rest of them. No comics. There are some ads. Actually, quite a few in this one here. It's mostly just stories. Weird Tales. Now this is what was called the Fu Manchu cover. There's actually a Detective Comics prior to Detective 27, which is the first issue comic book that Batman ever appeared on, that had Fu Manchu on it too. I don't know if that's the technical term, but I've seen it listed that way in guides, referring to Detective Comics in this same basic stylized cover. And I think there was actually a movie series called Fu Manchu as well too. The character I always thought was neat. $2.50. Dime Mystery Magazine. There's a lot that have dime in the title too. It's just the way to market it, I guess. Cheapness. $241 on this one here. This would be pre-code that they wouldn't be able to show nowadays either. So G-Man again, as I said, G-Man Gangsters, All Hot Topics. $225. Now these aren't going to sell for a ton of money. These are more in the range of the type that I find. Now, Doc Savage has been around for a long time. I think he came out in the 20s. I know he was still popular and had comic books into the 60s, 70s as well. And even there was paperback books in the 60s and 70s of Doc Savage. And if I'm not mistaken, maybe even Marvel Comics reissued a magazine-sized comic book for Doc Savage. It literally looks like that, stylish. I mean, it's a giant hand picking the guy up. A lot of the artists on these did comic book covers as well, and other magazine covers. Black Book Detective. This one's not the best artwork, but I just wanted to show you. It's a giant skeleton here, ships on fire. It's a really interesting comic cover. Or, it's a really interesting pulp cover, honestly. 10 cents. Weird Tales, just another interesting image. Pack of wolves getting attacked, adventure, and things like that. Another Robert E. Howard. Story-wise, the Dragnet. Again, they carried a lot of these titles over to, you know, modern day, like Dragnet TV series, Dragnet the movie. Another one here, Thrilling Detective. Now this is where things like the Green Ghost came in. It's a character that carried over into other fields, comics and radio stations and things like that, to radio shows. So anyway, that's just a touch on this. Usually they sell for the artwork, the scarcity, obviously. The earlier the issue, the earlier the one. The condition is huge. Mid-grade's about the lowest I would care to get one of these in, but that's about it on pulp magazines. Well, there you go. That's what I have for you today. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button down below. You can also hit the bell icon to be notified when I post new content or go live. Subscribe and tell a friend.